Well, thank you very much, Fred. It's a pleasure to see you all again. I want to thank President Obama for providing a suitable introduction to this afternoon's session, and I want to assure you that Speaker Boehner had no objection to its timing. The global economic outlook is a little darker today than it was when we last met in early April. I tend not to be on the dark side of these issues, but certainly I've revised down, at least moderately, my forecast for global growth, particularly among the advanced economies and especially for the United States. Now, in our division of labor for today, I want to mention the overall global picture, discuss briefly conditions in emerging markets, turn very briefly to other industrial countries, advanced economies, including those in Europe, but leave most of that discussion to Simon and Carmen, and then focus primarily on the U.S. economy, its performance, and prospects. Maybe page down. Maybe that's it. Nope. Don't know what we're doing here. Well, maybe try this one. Okay, very good. All right. So this is the summary of the global economic forecast. And as you can see, I have cut the forecast for world GDP growth using the PPP exchange rate weighting system from 4.3 to 3.8% for the current year, and from 4.5 to 4.2% for next year. The major revision is for both years. The bulk of it is accounted for by the advanced economies. And if you look at the advanced economies, you can see this year it's largely the United States and Japan. Japan, the impact of the earthquake was difficult to assess in early April. I think it's now clear that it was a larger negative than we had thought. But the recovery from that earthquake does seem to be underway, and so the forecast for next year is still for growth that is above 3% in Japan. In Western Europe, the first quarter actually turned out to be, for most countries, significantly stronger than was anticipated, especially so for Germany. Second quarter was significantly weaker, but even taking account of that weakness and the expectation that things will continue to be weaker in the second half, the year-over-year forecast for Europe for this year is not much changed from where we were in April for 2011. For 2012, there is more of a downward revision. However, I am not a pessimist on Europe. I think that they will get a handle on their financial crisis, and that for Europe as a whole, the prospects are not that bleak, although there clearly are a couple of countries that are going to be very much under the gun. Beyond Europe and the United States and Japan, the Canadian economy is a little slower than was anticipated, and other non-European advanced economies, that is to say Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, Israel, are again a little weaker than was anticipated. So those forecasts have been written down marginally. Now, what about emerging markets and developing countries? There, things have been coming in pretty much as anticipated. The numbers for the Chinese economy have held up quite well. I'd already written down the forecast from over 10% growth last year to a little over 9% this year, and that looks still to be fairly solid, probably be a little bit more sluggish next year, as we've seen recent evidence that the Chinese economy is slowing some. The Indian economy is a little bit more below forecast than the Chinese economy, but I still expect growth of around 8% this year and next. And the other Asian emerging market and developing countries have been continuing to do quite well. a little weaker than was anticipated, and certainly weaker than last year. But with China continuing to do well and Japan bouncing back from the earthquake, I think the other Asian economies will be reasonably well insulated from what's going on in the United States or in Europe potentially. In Latin America, results have been a little bit more disappointing than in Asia, and Brazil now looks to be on the course for about 4% growth this year, 4.5%, with a reduction of 1 percentage point and a half percentage point cut in my forecast for next year. I'm still a little above the consensus at this stage. I think the Brazilian economy will continue to do quite well. Mexico has also been cut some. It remains to be seen how much the slowdown in the United States will spill over to affect Mexico. So far, it's not been too bad. And the rest of Latin America is not much changed. And there's not much change in my forecast for other regions of the world. The turbulence in the Middle East and North Africa continues, and so I've written down my forecast for this year a little bit to reflect that. But I think next year will be in better shape. So emerging market countries forecast for this year down marginally, and for next year also down marginally. That brings us back to the advanced economies and to my primary focus this afternoon on the U.S. economy. As you can see from this page, I've cut this year's growth forecast to 1.8% from 3.3%. That's largely a matter of what the facts have shown. That is to say, the GDP results, which were revised at the end of July and then revision for the second quarter at the end of August, have been coming in well below my forecast of 3.5% to 4% growth during the first half. Indeed, if you believe the revised numbers, the U.S. economy was growing only 0.8% in the first half of this year, and was significantly more sluggish at the end of last year than previous estimates suggested. So that pulls down the year-over-year forecast, effectively cutting it in half, even if, as now seems likely, we get a little bit of acceleration in GDP growth in the summer and perhaps more in the fall. For next year, I've also cut the forecast. I need to reflect a little bit more now on President Obama's proposal and the likelihood of its passage, or parts of its passage, to think whether there's any upgrade in the growth forecast that is appropriate. But on balance, I still think that we're probably looking at growth maybe a hair above potential, or the old estimates of potential for next year. Now, I emphasized in April a couple of major uncertainties, one of which was the situation in the housing sector. Residential investment dropped enormously before and during the recession, and unlike all previous business cycle expansions where you got a strong recovery of residential investment early on in the general recovery, hasn't happened this time. Residential investment has essentially been flat since the middle of 2009. At some point, it is going to recover. We're not going to keep building 500,000 new housing units per year. We're going to get back up at some point to 1.5 million. And the question is when that process is going to start and how vigorously it's going to move. And my assumption is we'll see at least a modest piece of it between now and the end of next year. Another key issue in April was that the budget deal of the preceding December, provided for a temporary 2 percentage point cut in the payroll tax for expensing of business investment through the end of this year, for a 1-year extension of extended unemployment benefits, and various other elements of the old stimulus package. But all that was due to expire at the end of this year. And if that happened, it implied a fiscal tightening on the order of $200 billion. And the congressional action on the 2011 budget and the deal to raise the debt limit implied another 20 or 30 billion of deficit cut in 2012. And so the total, if you add in something from the state and local governments, was about 250 billion. And that's a large negative fiscal shock to absorb in a single year, and created the worry that if it actually happened, it would be a factor tending to restrain growth in 2012, if it happened. I thought even at that time there was a reasonable chance that it wasn't going to happen, or at least it was not all going to happen. And President Obama has proposed to make none of it happen, and indeed to go in the other direction and add $150 to $200 billion of additional fiscal support during 2012. So I don't think he'll get all of what he wants, and I'll return to the question of whether we should get most of what he wants at the end. But the worry that we're going to have a substantial fiscal contraction next year is very much moderated. I don't think the Congress will buy all of it, but I'm thinking we'll probably see at most a modest reduction in the fiscal deficit of the United States looking into 2012. Now, an additional concern is with the understanding and interpretation of what recent data have shown. And here I've reported sort of the key numbers. The old estimates of real GDP growth before the July revisions, the new estimates after the July revision and the most recent report at the end of August, the unemployment rate, the increase in employment according to the establishment survey, labor productivity growth, the rise in unit labor costs, and the rate of inflation as measured by the quarter-over-quarter rise in the core PCE, personal consumption expenditure price index, the index that the Fed focuses on primarily. Well, before the revision, we thought that growth accelerated in the end of 2009 and was reasonably well sustained in the first quarter, then crapped out in the spring of last year. And that was part of the reason why the Fed went into QE2. They thought the economy was really sluggish at that period. Also, if you look at the core PCE inflation rate, we were running in the 1% range or thereabouts, and it later fell in the summer to below 1%, so there was a concern about deflation. Well, now the GDP growth figure has been revised. No decline in output growth in the spring of last year. None. Now, I think that's probably nonsense, since virtually all of the other data said things did slow considerably a year ago in the spring. Going down a little further, the third quarter of last year, the summer of last year, was not much revised, but the fourth quarter estimate was cut from just over 3 to just over 2%. And then the first quarter estimate, which I thought was already too low at 1.9, was cut further to 0.4, so virtually no growth. And then the second quarter, consistent with a fair bit of data, certainly showed a slowing U.S. economy, and 1% is probably not a bad estimate. But the notion that we went up in our growth rate between the first quarter and the second quarter is not consistent with most other economic data. And we see that clearly in the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate stabilized around 9.6% through October of 2010, and then it fell to an average of 8.9% in the first quarter of last year, at a time when the economy supposedly had slowed already in the fourth quarter and virtually collapsed in terms of growth in the first quarter. The establishment employment figures raised the same conundrum. It is in the fourth quarter of 2002 and the first quarter of this year that we were getting big gains in establishment employment, and average hours worked per week were also going up slightly, in contrast to the revised GDP figures, which suggest that growth was crapping out. So there's something there that doesn't quite add up. Maybe it's the employment figures that are bad, but that's not the only information that suggests the old GDP figures provide a better view of how the economy was performing. Now, the labor productivity figures are not independent numbers. They are the arithmetic consequence of the estimates of output growth and of hours worked growth. And what they show is that during this last 2 quarters, when growth has slowed very considerably, we are now getting negative labor productivity growth. Corresponding with that, and with some acceleration in wage increases, unit labor costs have begun to move up really quite strongly over the last 2 quarters, suggesting that the increase in the core PCE inflation rate, which we see in the last column, is not just a fluke or something temporary. There may be something more substantial underlying it. In addition, the very sluggish productivity numbers suggest that maybe the potential growth rate in the US economy is not the 2.5% that I and most others have assumed, and maybe not even the 1.5% that the IMF has been pushing, but is really a very low number. If that's right, then the fiscal deficit problem is enormously more difficult to address. If underlying growth in the US economy is only on the order of 1 or 1.5%, we are in a real fiscal mess, and there's really basically no room at all anytime over the next decade to think about fiscal stimulus. And on the monetary side, if you believe the labor cost numbers and you think the core inflation rate is only beginning to reflect that, then the notion that monetary policy should have been eased any further looks, quite frankly, silly. Now, since I don't believe the GDP numbers, I also don't believe the labor productivity numbers, and I don't believe the unit labor cost numbers. At least I don't believe them in their entirety. So that's one of the reasons why I have a somewhat more optimistic view of the US economy. But you can't take the GDP growth numbers as gospel and ignore the inflation and productivity numbers. They come together. So if you say we've got a really serious problem with economic growth over the last 9 months to a year, then inflation is also much more of a worry than would have been thought. As I say, I think neither of those is really quite true, and so I'm a little bit more relaxed about the situation. Finally, let me come back to President Obama's proposal. Without the proposal, without any of it, we're looking at fiscal contraction of $200 to $250 billion. With it, we're looking at expansion between 2011 and 2012 of 150 to 200 billion. Right? We've already got it in 2011. The question is, how much are we adding or subtracting in 2012? And President Obama proposes to not subtract anything. That's 2 to 250, and then add another 150 to 200. That gets us up to the 450 figure. And that includes the payroll tax cuts, which are enlarged, the extension of unemployment benefits, and a number of other things, most of which are concentrated in 2012, and one can ask why that is, and a little bit of which slops over beyond. Now, the question I asked, which I didn't hear anyone else ask, is, and then what? We get to 2013. Do we raise the payroll tax back up for individuals and businesses? Do we stop dead in its tracks the extended unemployment benefits? Do we stop the transfers to state and local governments to pay for teachers and policemen and so forth? Do we take out virtually all of the additional 450 all in one shot in 2013, plus absorb the additional deficit reduction that is already programmed in from the budgetary actions the Congress took this summer? Because they didn't do very much in 2012, but they do more to 2013. So we would be looking at those circumstances under at a fiscal contraction on the order of $500 to $600 billion of GDP in 2013. That's what President Obama is proposing. Let's get a boost, 150 to 200 billion next year, and then a cut, 500, 600 billion the year following. I say that's what he's proposing because when he talks about the cost of his program at $450 billion, that's what he has to be proposing. That does not make any sense. We have no reason to believe that GDP growth otherwise would be particularly strong in 2013 after considerable weakness in 2012. Now, maybe President Obama is figuring out that, you know, the election of President Ron Paul will so stimulate the exuberance of the American people, along with Vice President Michelle Bachmann, that will be launched into 7 or 8% growth and will be able to absorb the fiscal consolidation that is otherwise on track. I don't think that that's really a likely scenario, so I would be significantly worried that doing as much as President Obama is asking for 2012 is going to present us with a real problem in 2013, or if we continue with it in 2013 and wind it gradually downward thereafter, is going to add not 450 billion, but at least $1 trillion or $1.5 trillion to the projected deficits over the next 5 to 10 years. And I think that that is unwise in present circumstances. So my expectation and my hope is that the president will get half or a little bit more than half of what he's asked for, but that we won't go beyond that, so that the fiscal contraction that we'll need to absorb in 2013 will be at least of manageable proportions.